I'm Chuck Hawkins, and it's my honor to introduce today's seminar speaker. It is on? Okay. It's frustrating to introduce someone like LeRoy because to do it justice would eat up most of his seminar time, and you don't want to listen to me, you want to listen to LeRoy. So I'll just give a very brief summary today. LeRoy has been on the faculty at Colorado State University since 1997, where he is currently professor of biology. And he also served as director of their graduate degree in ecology program for 8 years. He's also was appointed as distinguished professorial chair in riverine ecology and environmental flows at the University of Canberra, where he also advises students and collaborates with Australian colleagues. Prior to arriving at CSU, he was a research scientist at the University of Maryland, where he worked with another renowned stream ecologist, J. David Allen. And his academic training includes a BA in biology from Hendrix College in Arkansas in 1978, an MS in environmental science from Indiana University in 1983. He received his PhD from CSU, Colorado State, in 1989, where he worked with James Ward. And he subsequently did a postdoc at the University of Maryland in 1990 to 1992 with Dave Allen. LeRoy's interested in many aspects of stream ecosystems and general ecological theory. Topics he is maybe best known for include his work on understanding and characterizing the natural flow regime of rivers, understanding ecological adaptation to natural flow regimes and ecological responses to altered flows, ways to think about and quantify ecological limits to hydrologic alteration, improving our understanding of community assembly and maintenance by studying how landscape filters interact with species traits, including publishing the first compilation of stream invertebrate traits. And last but not least, effects of climate change on aquatic ecosystems. LeRoy publishes a lot, but more importantly, he is cited a lot. I told my stream ecology class a couple of weeks ago that they should attend his seminars and meet with him during his visit because he is amongst the best known stream ecologists in the world. I was wrong. As measured by number of citations, he is the top stream ecologist in the world. His more than 66,000 citations are well ahead of any other stream ecologist I checked, and he is far ahead of me. So much so that it would be pointless for me to give up my Netflix addiction in hopes of catching up. So I'm going to continue my subscription. His contributions to stream ecology and ecology in general have resulted in numerous awards and honors, including being elected as a fellow of AAAS, the Ecological Society of America, and the Society for Freshwater Science. LeRoy has given seminars to us before. This is his second trip out here, although his first one, I was told, was 19 years ago. And he gave seminars after almost directly after suffering a concussion. Fortunately, he's come to us concussion-free, I hope. Anyway, I'm very pleased that he's back, and it's very much my honor to introduce LeRoy Poff.
Well, thank you, Chuck. Is the volume okay? Okay, cool. Let's see. All right, so it's great to be here, back in Logan after 19 years. It looks like things have changed not too much, at least compared to Fort Collins, Colorado, which you wouldn't recognize from 19 years ago. So you guys are lucky to live in a nice, quiet university town. Thank you for the introduction, Chuck. That was, I guess I feel a little bit of guilt. I thought a couple times about including you as a co-author on some of my papers, but you know, you might have had to give up Netflix. Really, it's great to be here, and I'm happy to be able to talk about some of my work over the next couple of days. I want to thank the students and the program of ecology for the invitation. We have a similar, run a similar program at CSU, and you know, it's always you know, exciting to have people come in and talk about more general ecological themes. And I look forward to meeting some more of you. I've had good conversations today, and I will be giving a talk tomorrow as well. So, and just because I won't say anything about it at the end of the talk today, it will be on tropical temperate stream comparisons. It was a 5-year project, and if you're interested in integrative biology, it was a great project. Well, today I'm going to talk about challenges of freshwater ecosystem and biodiversity resilience in a rapidly changing world. Over the course of my career, which started like 35 years ago, I've been really interested in hydroecology, sort of how the dynamics of river flow, stream flow shape the physical habitat, influence adaptations of species. And during the course of that career, my interest suddenly became relevant because people generally started worrying about having enough water for the environment. So I was in a good position to sort of ride that train. And so I'm going to talk about a variety of topics today. It's a little bit maybe some different things that I try to pull together under this general heading. And I hope that it will cohere enough that you'll enjoy and learn some things. So let's see. So this is the laser pointer, but this is the advanced. Okay. So, we are troubling. Here we go. The unmarked button. As we all recognize, we're in a biodiversity crisis. Globally, humans are, consuming vast quantities of resources and driving species to extinction. And it's a real crisis. There's been a lot of calls recently for to do something. And freshwater systems, in particular, are very diverse. And this is just freshwater fishes of North America. It's sort of a mind-boggling graph. Freshwater diversity is declining at a faster rate than terrestrial or marine diversity. That's probably reflects partly the isolation of river systems and the speciation. And there are lots of drivers for that loss of diversity. Here's a spaghetti diagram from 2006. And there's no single cause of diversity loss, but one of the contributors and one of the things that we can possibly manage more effectively is this flow modification, how rivers are dammed and diverted, and how that has very negative effects on connectivity of habitats and on species success. So I'm going to focus on or talk about flow modification as sort of the general theme of my talk, and I'll cover a few aspects of my work over the years. So just to make another point, freshwater diversity is in peril. This is a global look, not threatened. Threatened is in purple. So, 20 to 40 to 50% of all major freshwater taxa are in peril on a global scale. And it's probably a big underestimate. And recently there was a paper by Tickner et al. That talked about bending the curve of biodiversity loss. So our current trajectory here, global freshwater biodiversity is down, business as usual, further down. And then talking about bending the curve, somehow doing things, intervening socially and managerially to reduce the loss of and even reverse the loss of freshwater diversity. And among the list of things, this emergency plan is to accelerate the implementation of environmental flows. So Chuck mentioned that I get to come up with that name for my Canberra position, and so it was sort of fun. How many of you have heard the term environmental flows? Okay, this is a well-educated audience. That's good. I'll get to the definition shortly. But so this, managing our rivers and freshwater systems from a more ecological perspective is one thing that we really need to do in order to reverse or dampen this trend in biodiversity loss. Lots of sources of hydrologic alteration. Of course, we live in a world, even before climate change, where systems are highly altered. And wetland loss is a really good example of that. And there's Utah didn't make it on the list, I see, so that's probably a good thing. But Colorado's 50%, California 91%. So we've extensively modified the landscape already, and that's had big effects on freshwater systems. I've focused a lot on dams because there are a lot of them, and they really alter flow regimes in a fundamental way that causes ecological degradation. If you're there are lots of dams around the world, okay, big dams, and then there are lots of dams proposed where we have areas that aren't areas that don't have dams over here. We've got a solution down here. We've got lots of hydropower dams proposed for these steep areas around the world. Whether they will get built or not is another question. But it's become clear to me that the future of our freshwater systems and the freshwater biodiversity really is linked strongly to how we manage these rivers with our water infrastructure. We've got a lot of it. Okay. So what can we do about this? This is where this notion of environmental flows comes in as an approach to restore ecological function, particularly in regulated rivers. Okay. And back in 2007, there was at the International River Symposium, there was a declaration put forth by not only scientists, but politicians and others from many countries called the Brisbane Declaration, which basically defines environmental flows and as the quantity, timing, and quality of water flows required to sustain freshwater and downstream estuarine systems and human livelihoods, because humans depend a lot on rivers as well, whether they're regulated or unregulated. So sort of the little cartoon version of that is we've got, water timing, quantity, and quality. Timing and quantity don't really matter if the quality is really bad, right? So that's an important part of the overall notion. And this supports ecosystem health and human well-being. So that's sort of the foundational, idea. This Brisbane Declaration was updated recently, and another call made for more action, right? So the implementation of environmental flows has proven pretty challenging, of course. So this is basically a restoration kind of philosophy. It's applied to rivers, and this is what we're aiming for with restoration, sort of generally. You could say it in different ways. And sort of the model we have, I think John Matthews, friend of mine, for this sort of idea, this is the Roman god Janus. January comes from Janus, and Janus is the god of change. So like seasonal change, summer to winter kind of thing. And what's interesting, if with this metaphor, we can think of Janus would look to the past to see how things worked, and then project that using the past information, be able to make future, speculations or predictions. Like the Janus Fund on the stock market. I'm not sure how it's doing these days, but that's sort of the idea. So the past is precursor to the future. The past portends the future. That works well under certain conditions. We'll get to that. People have been, working a lot to think about how do we use this historical information that we've collected, and a lot of it, going forward in time when, this assumption of the past being the predictor of the future is pretty weak. So the implicit assumption of this approach is that the structure and dynamics of a reference system, if you will, reflect the prevailing range of variation in environmental characteristics. In my case, flow, flow characteristics and ecological responses. And the evolutionary history of species is also important. What they've, what they have experienced over time and the adaptations they have to this historical regimes. A key constraint is that we are implying, or a stationary range of variation, right? So during the so-called Holocene, climate's been fairly stable. There's a way to statistically represent climate variability and things like 100-year floods and so forth. But once that stationarity goes away, then that poses potentially a really big challenge. So what is the principle? If I'm going to come to the climate change bit a little bit later on, but if we're sticking with the sort of the origins of environmental flows philosophy and this idea of restoration, and we're using a term like reference state, we give Chuck here a lot of credit for helping us understand what that means and doesn't mean. The guiding sort of philosophy behind restoration in streams and rivers is really this conceptual idea of a natural flow regime. Now, so that would be, a reference state, right? And restoration doesn't always aim for, restoration of the natural flow regime, but this is sort of the scientific basis for how we think about managing river systems currently. Now, the take-home message is that in the natural flow regime, the structure and function of river ecosystems and the adaptations of species are dictated by the pattern of temporal variation in river discharge. Okay, now that's clearly, a strong statement, right? Because it's not, river discharge is not the only factor that influences stream integrity. But in this 97 paper, we elevated flow regime to the sort of master variable status. We think about components of the flow regime, how big, range of magnitudes, frequency of disturbances, the timing of flow events, that kind of thing, as sort of regulating or interacting with these other important drivers of ecological integrity. And since flow is one of the things we can turn levers on, we sort of push this idea as a way to go forward in river management. And this paper had sort of an interesting origin. It was a collaborative effort and had both academics as well as NGOs, agency scientists. And the motivation really for this paper was when I was working with David Allen at the University of Maryland. He worked for American Rivers, which is an NGO. And we got to talking about how NGOs that are trying to promote river health and river, river sustainability, we're always pushing up against this idea that a minimum flow is all you need in order to maintain, a healthy river. And of course, we as scientists all knew that wasn't the case, that it was much more complicated. And so we wrote this paper with the intent of reaching, end users and, accessible language that public and political people alike could read, and maybe take some action. And it was just about the time the internet came online, and there was, a lot of people sort of took this idea up, and it just sort of, it seeded widely because it's based on, it was basically a review of the science for why flow variability is important for ecosystem integrity. And it's just become very, very widely accepted. And this is part of, I'm not sure about the number you gave for my citations, but it's a lot of them right here. So where did this idea come from? Well, back when I was a PhD student, we had a seminar. It's one of the great things about seminars at universities, and the idea was do whatever you want on river systems. And I was really interested. I grew up in a small town in Arkansas that had a dam built on the river, and it sort of changed the river from this really big, beautiful, green river to, a cold trout fishery. So I didn't like dams as a kid. And I went to CSU, and my major professor said, I'll pay for your research as long as you do it on a regulated river. And so that was like a bitter pill to swallow. But so I just devised experiments to do on the regulated river, some sort of, take advantage of the flow regulation. But I was still very fascinated by natural flow variability. And so in this seminar, I asked myself the question, how much flow variability is there across US rivers? We're having big ecological debates back then about stochastic versus deterministic structuring of communities. And it just struck me that no one was actually quantifying what this stochasticity might be. So I got together I got data from the USGS, from stream gauges, and it was on magnetic tapes, and downloaded it all and wrote some Fortran code and developed a way to characterize variability using several factors like predictability and frequency of big events and that kind of thing, and came up with an analysis for eventually several papers, eventually over 800 streams in the US, and how they could be classified according to their patterns of flow variability. So for example, here, this is a snowmelt stream. It's on a log scale, so it looks bimodal, but it's actually strongly unimodal on an untransformed scale. And there are lots of those around. You have those around here. Pacific Northwest, you have this very dominant sort of winter peaks and high base flow summers. In the desert, more bimodal, winter and spring versus summer monsoons. Some places in the more intermittent parts of the country, just totally like unpredictable and very stochastic. It's southeast, high base flows, but it's very stochastic. And then groundwater systems, which are pretty flat. So we're looking at the day of the year here and over a number of years, and this is the amount of flow. And so you can see these snowmelt streams are quite predictable relative to the stream in Oklahoma. So it seemed to make sense that there would be different ecological adaptations to these different kinds of, regimes, and subsequently published papers that showed that as well. So I'm going to have to, sort of skip over some highlights here just to try to get all this in. But so the basic idea here then is that differences in flow variability lead to differences in, hydrologic in disturbance regimes that lead to differences in ecological patterns and evolutionary adaptations. So that's, sort of the underlying thinking. And then when people started getting interested in environmental flows and how to, advise managers on managing rivers, this sort of moved into the applied domain. And I like this figure a lot. It's from 2002 from a couple of Australians. It basically show that there are particular geomorphic ecological processes associated with different parts of a flow regime. And this is really sort of a key component. So here's the hydrograph, looks like a snowmelt hydrograph. These dotted lines represent interannual variation. So some like rising flows can be, and so they identified several principles. Principle one is that these flows, and we know this from geomorphology, these high flows in particular maintain channel form and habitat diversity, right? Here's another principle too that says that life history patterns such as spawning and recruitment coincide with like recession of peak flows. Peak flows also provide access to floodplains, and if they're predictable, you have things like the flood pulse, an annual events that organisms have evolved to take advantage of. And then these low flows are important as well. So these stable, low flows also contribute to, recruitment success. And then this is a little more controversial, I think. Principle 4, natural regime discourages invasions. And that sort of depends on the, whether the species that's invading has been pre-adapted. And, I was talking to some students earlier today about the difficulties in actually predicting invasions because there's a lot going on that we don't really understand, particularly genetically. So anyway, this was sort of the a major component of what became environmental flows. Okay, and so the variability that's inherent in a natural river maintains the system complexity, and if you change these components, like the timing and the magnitude of the high flows, then you're going to have ecological consequences, geomorphic and ecological consequences. And dams really do significantly alter these natural flow regimes. And I'm not going to show you a lot of figures and, but one that I like, and I did with David Lytle at Oregon State when we're looking at adaptations to natural flow regimes, is the Green River here in Wyoming and Utah, the Flaming Gorge Dam. And you can see, so we have years here, 2000 down back to 1930, and seasonally from summer, August, around to October. So this is basically, the beginning, like an annual cycle. Well, this is just a sort of a seasonal cycle to show the snow melt. So in the early years before the dam was built, we see that in the winter, February, December, and so, seems a lot, I'm not sure about that. We have these predictable low flows. And then we have these snowmelt peaks in the winter, in spring, right? And the dam, which goes in here, basically homogenizes that pattern. So the peaks are reduced, except in really high years like 1983, when Glen Canyon Dam was almost lost apocryphally, and very high winter base flow. So that's really changed, and temperatures changed as well, which I'm not going to talk about. And that's really altered the structure of rivers across the U.S. These kinds of changes, and there's plenty of data to show ecological changes, and that's another sort of a seminar. I'll give you one example. But when we talk about restoring these systems that have these dams on them, it's obviously a very expensive and complicated thing to do. And even if we have these principles, these scientific principles of what's needed in order to restore certain ecological processes, we can't usually do that in full, but sort of an aspiration of environmental flow restoration would be this sort of what has recently popularly been called functional flows, restoring flows that perform specific functions, whether they're channel maintenance or providing high flows for fish to get onto floodplains. And here's and the Nature Conservancy was very involved in this whole process for many years, and they came up with this really nice figure. So we got our natural flow regime here, the dotted line, or I guess a given year. And so the idea is, aspirationally, we'd like to have some flow at this time of year that's pretty high in order to perform those functions that it would naturally. Long periods of low flow, some, late season spiky flows to represent storms. So that's sort of, you see that there's a lot of water that's not staying in the river, but the idea is to provide these functional flows at critical times with the hope that that will be enough to restore ecosystem and ecological integrity. And of course, Jack Schmidt in the back there is very familiar with all this, these high peak flows to restore sandbars in the Colorado River. In the Grand Canyon, of course, they were at the wrong time of year, but the trout probably didn't care at that. So from an ecological perspective, we would like these high flows to be, done at the right time of year. And I was talking to Michelle Baker earlier today. The state of Utah now is apparently moving in a way, in progressing sort of towards this idea because of the problems with Great Salt Lake. And I hope that goes forward. I want to give you one example of how an environmental flows can be used effectively. This is probably what the poster child of environmental flows is cottonwoods, right, populous species. And the cottonwoods, as you know, they drop their seeds disperse in the late spring. It coincides with snowmelt runoff in many interior west rivers. And so if we look, here we are. There's a model called this recruitment box model that maybe they're not working much either. So anyway, you can see there's the runoff here, and in May and between May and July, there's this box, and this box represents the time that coincides with the timing of seed release, and if flows are sufficiently high, inundation of the floodplain, which scours the floodplain and provides germination sites for these little cottonwood seeds. And then importantly, the rate of recession, how fast the water is draining from the soil from these inundated floodplains after the peak passes. And so that's three components of the natural flow regime: the magnitude, the timing, and the rate. Okay, that have to be in place simultaneously in order for cottonwoods to recruit. And so in the Truckee River, the upstream dam has captured peak flows to the point that here's an old black and white picture that we see these geriatric tree stands along the river. Okay, so this wintertime, there's no leaves, but there are also no seedlings, no saplings. And so Stuart Rood and others managed to get a flow release for 5 years to get flow releases that were high flows in this time window right here, and new seedlings established immediately. They converted saplings a few years later, eventual stands of adults. And so basically by using our hydroecological knowledge and with cooperative management, we're able to reestablish these cottonwood trees along the Truckee River. Okay, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it's just to show that there's a lot of action in this area. Issues of journals, books, policy guidance documents. Even the World Bank, the Nature Conservancy, European Union has recognized sort of the need for environmental flows. Basin planning, several places, including in Australia. So even the USGS has a division of ecological flows that's been around for about 15 years or so. Interestingly, right before former President Trump was inaugurated, the EPA and the USGS put out a technical report that talked about the importance of hydrologic alteration on aquatic life. And that's, if you're interested in sort of crossover between sort of the science and some legal issues, this is a good thing to look at. State of California has really been promoting in the Bay Delta, more naturalized flows. Even at a global scale, if you've heard of this Sustainable Development Goals, there's one on clean water and sanitation, and there's a chapter in there. Indicators, they have to come up with indicators in order to gauge whether or not we're moving in the right way for these goals. And there's one indicator that it has to do with a water stress and incorporating environmental flows into water stress. Now that becomes very simplistic. It's almost like a minimum flow, applied at a global scale. But this is all to sort of acknowledge that there's been a big increase in the awareness of and the use of environmental flows on a national and global scale. And one of the big challenges for the environmental flows approach is you have, like, how do you manage a river that you don't have biological information for, or you don't have hydrological information for. And that's most of the rivers, right? So there's going to be sacrifice of detail for some more general kinds of principles. And so a lot of us, many of my colleagues and I were worried about this problem, and so developed this workshop and paper, which we called the LOHA. And there are 19 authors on it. And basically, we came to a scientific consensus about how to guide the development for e-flows in understudied systems. And here's just a chart. I'm not going to belabor it, but notice there's a sort of a hydrographic component. If you can use hydrologic modeling to develop sort of what the hydrologic baselines are. There's a flow ecology relationships here, and then a social component, because social preferences are clearly very important in any kind of river management scheme. And so that's sort of where things stand, or have been standing. The LOHA has been sort of a framework for thinking about larger basins and environmental flows where you don't have good information. But meanwhile, there's a crisis in water resources management has emerged, and it spills over to us. And that is global warming, rapid global warming. And so if we go back thousands of years to the end of the last ice age, we see that, and for the last 10,000 years or so, we've had fairly stable climates, right? Whatever that may mean to you. But over this time, we see that atmospheric CO2, as humans have become more active and populous, have begun to increase. And now we're in this really rapid, on this scale, you can see how rapid the recent warming is. And of course, that has really huge implications for statistically characterizing, hydrologic regimes. So Milley and others wrote this famous paper in 2008 called "Stationarity is Dead." How many of you have heard of this paper? Yeah, it's a good read. And basically what it means for hydrologists and water resources managers is that we no longer have a statistical foundation for reliably predicting sort of the odds of meeting water supply needs and that kind of thing. As the mean conditions, or as the mean temperature is warming, we're getting big, we're seeing a lot more extreme events that are including hydrologic extremes that are accompanying that change in the mean. And so this has created a real challenge for water resources managers. And I'm going to come back to that in just a couple of minutes. But it's also obviously influences how we think about e-flows. If we have some historical reference condition, baseline condition, then that's changing. And just as one example, here's the state of Washington. You can see these are stream segments that have been classified according to current hydrology. And the green is rain. The red over here is snowmelt. If you project out to the 2040s, this was done in 2010, this paper. So you see that this red area, whoops, this shows that we see this red area has become more green. And so what's happened is that, I dropped a slide. It basically shows that these different classes of streams are becoming much more rainfall dominated, including the lower elevation snowmelt systems. So what does that mean for us as environmental flow scientists if we want to set some reference condition, or we use the historic record to help guide us into a management scenario? It's a real challenge, because we have all this historical empirical relationships between flow and ecology, right? And now the systems are changing, and those correlations may or may not hold up well in the future. So if we go back to the Aloha model, I'll just show you, and it sort of really scared me when I started thinking about this seriously, because in this Aloha model, which is sort of a global standard, if you will, at least it's used in a lot of places, baseline hydrographs is subject to non-stationarity, right? What's the baseline? Whoops. Degree of hydrological alteration. Well, how much of it's natural and versus climate induced? These flow ecology hypotheses that are based on correlational information. These relationships. So, and certainly people's reactions to climate change and to hydrology are going to have big impacts on future sustainability. So, we really have three paradigms for ecosystem management. I would say one, we have our, preservation, and that's great. But then the sort of ecological restoration, the one we've mostly been operating under for 50 years is, use the past to guide actions into the future. And then we've got a more realistic current situation, which is a dynamic climate, and assume that these systems are constantly changing. So restoration becomes more of a moving target, right? Because you don't really have some condition you can restore to if that system is moving away from that historical condition through climate change. So I'd like to talk a little bit about this model of assuming dynamic climate. It presents a real problem, a real challenge for us as scientists, as well as using science to convey to managers how to manage systems. So in this notion of if we manage change, what do we want to manage for? Well, I would argue that one of the things we need to really think hard about is resilience. We want systems to be managed in a way that maintains as much as possible their current biodiversity and the kinds of goods and services that they provide. And so this resilience is a term, it's widely used, it has many different meanings, but basically how I want to talk about resilience is having three elements. One is persistence, so you have a state that has certain elements, species, let's say, and these system attributes persist over time, okay? Even if they're disturbed or perturbed. Whoops. Secondly is adaptability. And I'll go to this. So here's our sort of, Holling cup and ball model, right? Where you've got some kind of, a basin of attraction. And as long as the species and, their relative abundances and so forth persist, we'll remain in this state. And if a disturbance comes along, and it's pushes the system, it's still within this space, this sort of, it has the ability to adapt. And so persistence really sort of represents a whole range of different sort of representations of, say, a community. Maybe the relative abundances of species in the community change over time in response to disturbance, but the system overall remains a grassland, let's say. And then there's this transformation, which is much more talked about in sort of social ecological resilience and social systems. But if we push this system too far, it can transform into something else. And sometimes, sometimes, it may transform into things that are, the Aral Sea going to a dry desert is a kind of transformation that's really not irreversible, and it's a bad new state. So we have certain desired states and undesirable states, and so we're sort of going to be forced to think about how do we know when to intervene with management in order to either maintain the state or to guide it into a more favorable, possibly favorable alternative state. And so here's our little the tipping point here, and if our system moves beyond the tipping point, then you get moving to another state. This would be like clear water lakes and turbid water lakes. It would be sort of a classic example from the literature. And was Brian Besselmeyer, you might know him. Peter is a CSU student, actually wrote this nice paper that sort of shows that as we move, if we can detect that we're getting close to a state transition, then we can intervene, managerially and try to push it back into its into the desirable state. Now, this is all really sort of, this is very conceptual. It's very difficult to actually measure these things. A lot of people are putting a lot of effort into doing that. But I think this is a good heuristic, a good way to think about how we want to manage our future our future river ecosystems. So where do we go from here? We have, the Janus looking back. We still need to understand these processes. So we've got, a lot of work that's done, has done that. But then going forward, we're going to be seeing novelty and a need to move away from sort of correlation and into more process-based understanding, which is something that's widely recognized, that people don't really embrace that oftentimes because it's really hard to do process-based science especially if you're an ecologist. Okay, so but that's what we're faced with. We need to sort of change the way we think about doing environmental flows. And so here's a paper that John O'Tonkin and I and some others published, which sort of made this point about we need to focus on resilience. We need to move away from correlations because of their sort of maybe historical, weakness. And we need to think about fundamental mechanistic responses of species to flow regimes. So, for example, the Cottonwood story shows the importance of understanding the mechanisms that allow for cottonwood to be successful. And there are a growing number of examples of that approach. And from this paper, this is an interesting result, looked at a model Dave Lytle developed on a riparian system in I think the Yampa River. And we have cottonwood and sagebrush, as shoreline species. And if you increase the frequency of droughts through simulation over time, if you use our correlational understanding of what's going to happen is this dotted line. We see that cottonwood abundance remains about the same. Sagebrush, goes up a little bit, but he built a population dynamics model that included vital rates were linked to the flow regime. And what we see is that under a process-based mechanistic understanding, cottonwoods decline tremendously after, when drought frequency increases to about 0.5, whereas sagebrush increases. And that's what it's sort of intuitive, that makes sense, right? But that's the difference between using a correlation approach and a process-based approach. Okay. What time is it? 5 minutes. So I'm going to very briefly, I always say very briefly, we end at 5, right? Okay. So I got together with some people to organize a workshop at the National Center for Socio-Environmental Systems. And it strikes me is that we have, an opportunity here going forward, because we are sort of in the same boat as water managers now and sort of dealing with all this uncertainty. There's a growing social desire for, biodiversity maintenance and healthy systems. And so if we think about non-stationarity from a conservation ecology point of view, we think about, well, let's maintain the integrity of systems, but what are our targets? We have to decide what we want as our targets. From a hydrologic point of view, engineers think about reliability and optimization, and those potentially, if we have more of this ecologically, if we have more integrity, then we have more resilience. From a hydrologic point of view, more robustness. And what's happening, I think, is that we're all sort of struggling with this, and we can maybe have more common ground with water resources managers to present new opportunities for the future for management. And I don't really want to go into much detail about this paper we wrote, but I think it does sort of just diagrammat. I can show figures here, sort of the idea, which is if you take, so the future is uncertain, right? And if we want to model, say, a system for its ability to reliably provide water to a city or a farming system, then we've got a couple of climate variables, maybe storm frequency and average runoff, and within a certain space, in this two-dimensional space, our system is successful if it's in this wide area, and it fails if it gets outside of this space. Now, from an ecological point of view, we can draw perhaps the same conceptual figure, and then if we superimpose those, what we see is that there's an area of overlap. That area of climate space can meet both ecological and sort of hydrology engineering needs, and that's sort of, I think, where we need to be moving, is trying to find some common ground and a common framework for discussing how we want to manage our freshwater systems. So basically, I'll just sort of skip through all this because of time, but I'll come to I'll just have to skip that, I'm sorry. But you can see it's a very quantitative approach that allows us to look at different management options, like whether to build raised levees or reoperate reservoirs, and we can identify how different management interventions can be more successful or less successful for engineering and for ecology, and maybe find some common areas here where we have common ground, and aim perhaps for managing these systems towards that common ground. All right, so to finish up here, so we have some major challenges ahead of us in the environmental flows field, and I think it's really important that you as students and us as academics, and really begin to think about how we want to deal with these challenges. And these shifting hydrologic baselines are really a big challenge. So we need to think about dynamic modeling of future runoff in probabilistic terms, given the uncertainties. Our shifting ecological baselines are a problem, so we have to reevaluate our management targets. We want to scale up for conservation and resilience from the local to the basin scales, including connectivity. Okay. Social engagement is really important. And I think we're going to be moving into a period where we're managing flow for adaptation and resilience. And that's not going to be easy. In fact, it's going to be really hard. But that's sort of the cards we've been dealt. And it's already taking hold. Like, the federal government has gotten all the agencies together that have sort of land management responsibilities, and they've developed this framework called RAD, resist, assist, and direct. And it's this idea of, if a system is going to transform into another state, then you can either try to resist that, or if it's inevitable, if it aren't the resources and the knowledge, you can assist it into that other state, or direct it to a different state. So this is sort of an emerging recognition among agency scientists, and that we need to adaptively manage for the trajectory that systems are headed on based on changing climatic conditions. All right, so where next for e-flows? Well, we need to make a better case, I think, to the public why it's important. We want a biodiverse future. We want these ecosystem services to continue to be provided. We need to do collaborative vision setting with with other stakeholders. And this happens in a lot of adaptive management circles already, but this is something I think when I was being trained as a scientist, I wasn't thinking in terms like, collaborative vision setting with, or even in terms of what am I willing to lose as an ecologist and my recommendations for how this river is managed. Okay, we need to think about thresholds that are of concern to us and communicate those to the public. We need better science, of course, as always. That'll be true when you guys are my age. Managing for resilience. Okay. So how do we manage for sustainable biodiversity and provision of ecosystem goods and services? Well, we have to decide what it is we want. Okay, as conservation ecologists, not that you're one, but what do we want as conservation ecologists? What state would we desire? Then we need to use our process-based knowledge to establish the probability of achieving that goal, right? And there's a lot of uncertainties involved, which is sort of why we might think of it in probabilistic terms. We need to engage the public, and when the public has to be behind these, our desire to conserve freshwater ecosystems. And there's a big economics component to that I won't get into. Engage water managers and engineers. And then I think this RAD approach, resist, assist, or direct, it's a good approach for us to gauge what our management actions should appropriately be, and how to make decisions, how to prioritize limited money into management interventions in order to maintain the desired states that we want. Okay. All right, so ran over a little bit, but I want to thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions if there's time for that. Thank you.